Now we're getting back into the world of multiple scenarios with regard to the intake manifolds, but prepping the block and heads is a pretty universal process, starting of course with some kind of solvent cleaner. Then for most motors it's a real good idea to put a teardrop-sized blob of silicone sealant in the four corners where the heads meet the block. Next we put some gasket sealer around the water ports and their mating surfaces of the intake gaskets. When the sealer on the gaskets tacks up, you can stick them in place and line up the bolt holes. When they're lined up, spread some more gasket sealer on the tops of the gaskets around the water ports. On Chevys and some other types of engines, if the decks were cut, the heads will sit a little bit lower and the gap here between the intake manifold and the block rail will be smaller. The stock rubber gaskets that are in your gasket set will be too thick to allow the intake to seat properly. To seal the block rail to the intake, run a 1/4 inch bead of silicone sealer along the front and rear upper rails of the block. Run the bead evenly from gasket to gasket. We recommend you do this for all Chevys regardless of the decks being cut or not. It provides a much better seal. When the block is all ready, double check that the oil splash guard is in place on the bottom of the intake, if it has one, and lower the intake in place. Get some help if you need it. Cast iron manifolds are very heavy, and you want to lower it as close to position as you can. Hopefully you'll only need to tap the manifold to get the bolt holes to line up. The intake manifold bolts for most engines lead directly into the oil-soaked area under the valve covers. Treat the threads of these bolts with non-hardening sealer or some ARP thread sealer to avoid oil leaks. As you snug up the bolts, on a lot of motors it's hard to get to any of the bolts that are near the plenum of the intake with a socket, so you use the box end of a wrench. The intake bolts usually have a tightening sequence similar to the heads, but the sequence usually starts with the middle bolts near the plenum. Tighten one of the bolts that you can get to with a torque wrench at the first increment, then put a box end wrench on the same bolt and feel how tight it is. Now you can guesstimate how tight to make the first few bolts in the sequence. Do this for the first few inaccessible bolts for each of the 3 increments. Now let's button up the engine externals, starting with the harmonic balancer. If it has scratches on the